nitrous oxide. Currently, nitrous oxide is at this level here for firm. This is the reductions in emissions that power plants have achieved. And they've reduced it by this amount to try to meet the environmental standards. But cars could reduce it at this cost. And so you've basically had all this loss in this area here that comes from more expensive ways of reducing emissions in factories rather than the cheaper ways you could get of reducing emissions in cars, because you don't set this uniform price. Instead, you just mandate that the factory is reduced by a certain amount. Okay. So in the US, most Pigouvian taxes in practice are collected through the legal system. So when when a firm or an individual causes harm to someone else, they get sued usually. And the court assesses how much harm they caused and makes them pay that. The individual causing the harm usually has to pay a few types of damages. One are called compensatory damages, which are the harms that are directly caused by the action. A second type are called punitive damages, and these deal with two sorts of problems. So on the one hand, punitive damages deal with the problem that you don't always catch everyone who causes harm. And therefore, we should scale up the amount that you have to pay so that it's divided by the probability that you get caught, so that on average, you pay the damages associated with the harm that you do. But a second reason you do punitive damages, which are sometimes, rather than being paid to the person who's harmed, paid to the government, is that think about the example of the car that we were talking about. If someone was running a red light when they got hit by a drunk driver, you don't want them to get the full damages, right? Because they're moving into the path of an externality. And that is making the externality worse, because they're not taking full care to make sure that they're unlikely to get harmed by the externality, right? And so if you pay some of the damages to this government rather than to the person that's harmed, you give people an incentive to avoid being harmed by externalities, right? So what the litigiousness of the Anglo-Saxon legal systems are doing is really incorporating Pigou. They're incorporating the principle of payment in accordance with product. Because not everything can be covered by statutes. And in fact, the fact that in the United States we have all these lawsuits and all these payments which people who are on the right tend to oppose is actually a reflection of the fact that in the US we believe in payments in accordance with product and not in detailed regulation of every activity that people do, right? So in Europe, they have many more statutes restricting what people can do, but many fewer lawsuits. And those two things substitute for one another, right? Rather than having these, but in the US, because we believe in payments in accordance with product, because we don't believe in detailed regulation of people's behavior, instead we have all this litigation. So while the right is usually opposed to trial lawyers and litigation, in fact, that's exactly a manifestation of the fact that we're using a much more market-oriented system to allocate resources, whereas the Europeans have all these regulations and have many fewer lawsuits, right? So in Europe, what they do is much more directly control people's behavior, rather than just make people pay the consequences of their actions. But in reality, it's much more of a spectrum between the two, because in the US, liability is rarely for just having caused harm. That's called strict liability. Instead, usually it's based on what's called negligence, which is that you failed to take due care. Well, what's due care? Well, that's basically saying that there's some activities that are just irresponsible and that you're just sort of prohibited from doing, and other activities which you're allowed to do and you won't be forced to pay if randomly some bad thing ends up happening. So an example of this is that there was a famous Supreme Court case where someone was getting onto a train and they had a box in their hands. And the person on the train sort of helped them onto the train, and in the process, the box fell out. Now, it turns out the box was full of fireworks. And the fireworks fell down and like blew up the whole train station. And all sorts of people got hurt. And they decided that it wasn't reasonable that that person who was helping the other person on board could have anticipated that that was full of fireworks and would cause all this damage. So they didn't make them pay for all the damage that it caused by blowing up the fire station, but they did make them pay an amount that was equal to what reasonably could have been considered to have been in that box, like something fragile, right? And the reason they do that is because of all the things we were saying earlier about not wanting to have people face too much risk and not wanting people to not being able to charge people for things that they can't possibly pay. We tend to instead base things on sort of what a reasonable person would have thought that the harm from this was, rather than all the harm that you ended up causing. Another classic example is medical malpractice. In medical malpractice, we don't charge the doctor for all the harm that he caused, just what reasonably could have thought to have been caused by his actions. And even then, especially when we don't do that, doctors end up getting insurance, which ends up making them really only have to pay in response for doing something bad what the insurance company thought was reasonable, rather than what the legal system makes them bear. So even if they don't end up in the end paying, even if the legal system makes them pay something that's closer to strict liability, an insurance program will end up having them do something more like negligence, because it wants to provide them insurance against things, and then it has to monitor them somewhat, right? Okay. So the more that you have insurance, the more you're moving to a directly regulated system like the Europeans have, because the medical malpractice insurance providers are going to prohibit the doctors from doing certain things in order to make sure that they don't rack up too much liability for the insurance company. Okay. So an equivalent way to do a Pigouvian tax, at least for certain intents and purposes, is that you can cap the total amount of the activity going on and then allow people to have tradable permits to do it. And Stieg, how does that work? Why is that equivalent?
Because you're still getting the people who originally buy it, I guess, pay the externality, and then future people are paying for that to the previous people that had it. So.
Yeah, so that's right. So the simplest way to think about it is, imagine that we put a cap on something, and then we have an auction for these permits. The clearing price at the auction is basically just the tax that you have to pay in order to do the thing, right? So if we know what the clearing price at the auction will be for any quantity we give, then there's a complete equivalence between holding an auction for tradable permits and imposing a tax, right? Now, we'll also raise in that auction the same amount of revenue we would raise by doing cap and trade. But in politics, people often prefer cap and trade over charging a tax, because they like to give some of those permits to the people who are currently doing the activity to buy their political support. And it sounds like you're not giving those people just money. You're not just bribing them to support it. It sounds like you're giving them just what they sort of deserve, which was these permits. But in reality, there's no difference. The permits are just worth money. And you could just hold an auction rather than giving out those permits. And so it's really just a sort of hidden way of paying a bribe to people to support the legislation. Okay. But putting aside the political reasons why we might do this, the question is there an economic logic that favors cap and trade versus taxes? And Marty Whitestein investigated this problem, and he emphasized the fact that when you set one of these policies like cap and trade or Pigouvian taxation, you're usually uncertain about what the private demand is going to be for doing the activity, and that cap and trade and Pigouvian taxation can behave very differently in these circumstances. So to formalize that, let's imagine that the marginal private value, sort of the inverse demand curve for the market as a whole for doing this activity, is given by this equation. It's equal to some price minus of the quantity. So there's like a downward sloping excess market demand curve for doing this activity. And imagine that the social cost increases in this linear way as you do more of it. So if you pollute more, it gets more harmful, right? OK. Now, the optimum, if we could just choose as a society, would be to equate the marginal private value and the marginal social cost. But I've got this little epsilon term in here. What's that epsilon term? That represents the uncertainty we have about what the private demand will be. We could also put uncertainty into what the social cost will be. Turns out that won't matter for this purpose, so I'm just going to leave it out. OK, so the social optimum would be to set the quantity equal to the quantity that would be optimal when epsilon's equal to 0, this q star, plus a over a plus b times epsilon. What's a over a plus b? Well, a is the slope of the private demand curve, and b is the slope of the social cost, right? So the higher is the steeper is the private value, the more that you're going to want to respond to epsilon. And the steeper is the social cost, the less that you're going to want to respond to epsilon. How can we see that? Well, look at this graph. Imagine that the slope of the private value is very inelastic, right? And the social cost is very elastic. Well, then, as the private value curve moves around, the quantity is going to move around a lot. On the other hand, if the social cost is very inelastic and the private value is relatively elastic, then things don't move around that much as we move around the private value, right? Because the social cost is so inelastic. More formally, we can compute what the Harburger triangle that is caused by deviating from this social optimum level here is. And that's because it's a triangle, just going to be 1/2 a plus b times the difference between q that we actually have and q star. The linear nature of these curves is what makes it exactly a triangle. So if we impose a price at p star, which is the best price that we could impose from an ex ante perspective, then we're going to be fully responsive to the epsilon, right? On the other hand, if we impose the optimal quantity, the best quantity control we could have, it would just be at the level q star, which would be the optimal in the absence of epsilon, because if epsilon is on average 0, there's nothing different from that we want to do. So a question is, which is closer? And this graph sort of tells us. Imagine that we impose the quantity control, right? If we're in this world where the private value is very inelastic and the social value is very elastic, then the Harburger triangle created by the quantity control, which would get us to do this quantity and that quantity, is going to be very big. It's going to be this squiggly area here. On the other hand, if we impose the price control, that gets us here, which is very close to what would be socially optimal, or here, which is very close to what would be socially optimal. And so the Harburger triangle associated with it is just this tiny little